Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zembler Miller.
Jewish school kids in America, from kindergarten to high school, are facing a dramatic increase of anti Semitism and marginalization since October 7th. We discussed this with Sara Colb, the Deputy Regional Director for the Anti-Defamation League's New England Regional Office. Before joining the Anti-Defamation League, Sarah was Assistant Attorney General in Massachusetts, where she worked on a wide range of discrimination cases. Her grandfather was a Holocaust survivor and hero who saved many Jews. Sarah, welcome to our show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So today I asked the first question, which is, could you describe to us some of the anti-Semitism that Jewish school children and teachers are experiencing in K through 12 schools in New England since October 7th, 2023,
Sure.
obviously.
Sure. So I'll just start by explaining, for those who don't know already, at the Anti-Defamation League, one of the most important things that we do for the community is we provide insight into both nationally, regionally, and for individual states on the numbers of anti-Semitic incidents that happen, at least that are reported to us. We know that these incidents are vastly underreported, but we provide data on what the numbers look like from year to year. Since starting as deputy director for the New England region about a year ago, so after 10/7, about March of 2024, I have had a particular focus on K through 12. And there has been a very disturbing rise in anti-Semitic incidents in our K through 12 classrooms. Much of what that looks like includes things like swastika vandalism incidents in schools. So somebody drawing a swastika on a bathroom door or on somebody's book, students being bullied or harassed because of their Jewish identity, students making Nazi-related gestures and jokes, this type of thing. I think it's important to note that these incidents were on the rise even before 10/7, but the horrors of that day and the war that ensued afterwards has contributed to a really significant surge. So, in my view, I think part of what's happening is the anti-Semitism that we're experiencing and seeing across the country and frankly across the world that's playing out in the public square is like every other thing that we do and talk about showing up in our children's classrooms. Kids pick up on what they're seeing around them. And unfortunately, this hate, including some really extremist symbols and language, are starting to become normalized.
So I have a
So,
question.
yeah,
Is there a difference between Israeli children and American Jewish children in the treatment? And really, how does neo-Nazism translate into pro-Hamas sentiment, if it does?
So, to your first point, I would say that I think for Israeli students, the experiences are even more challenging because they are experiencing not only, hate and discriminatory treatment on the basis of their Jewish identity, but also on the basis of their place of national origin. And of course, for many Israeli students, they personally know people who were directly impacted by 10/7, including people who were murdered, or they may have family who are serving in the IDF. So the rhetoric that's taking place, across pretty much all aspects of our civil society and the ways that that is translating in many cases to hate showing up in the classroom, I think has a particularly harmful impact on Israeli students. And I think one of the really heartbreaking ways that this is showing up, both for Israeli and Jewish students, is that kids are feeling more reluctant to show their Jewish identity. And, ADL and Hillel International did a study that showed that 41% of Jewish college students are hiding their identity. So if we think about that, I don't have a number for you for kids, but if you think about just where college kids are in their sort of developmental becoming adults, right? And they've had more time to establish a sense of pride in their identity. For kids, where there's like pressure to significant social pressure to fit in, and who haven't had the same amount of time to sort of establish who they are and a pride in that identity, I imagine the numbers are even higher than that and are
Yeah.
really concerning.
Yeah. So those swastikas that are drawn in classrooms and in schools, is this, as Phyllis implied in her question, is this an expression of neo-Nazism, or is it an accusation of being Nazis towards the Jewish students?
I think it's really difficult to say. I think in terms of the young students that we're often talking about, it's hard to imagine that they have much, if any, background on what that symbol means. Of course, that changes when you get into sort of the teenage years, but I will say that there are many who claim that their expressions of anti-Zionism are unrelated to anti-Semitism. Well, I will just offer to you the fact that we have seen many instances of vandalism where the swastika is replacing the Star of David in the Israeli flag. I don't really think you could put a more fine point on the interplay between these forms of hate. And of course, many of the statements that are being made in furtherance of these anti-Zionist ideologies are claims that have been made against Israel far before 10/7, right? So, I mean, I remember even in my young life, as a 20-something-year-old encountering somebody making arguments that Israel was the new Nazi Germany. And of course, this is long before the current war and the horrific death toll for both Israelis and Palestinians. So I think there is definitely a connection. I think there's probably far from enough understanding at the school age level of what these symbols mean. And unfortunately, there are times when schools are failing to respond properly and provide that education around why this symbol is so harmful, not just to the Jewish community, but to other communities as well.
Yeah. What is the role of the Massachusetts Teachers Association in all this?
So, to give a little bit of context, the Massachusetts Teachers Association is a statewide union of teachers. It's the largest one in Massachusetts. I think they represent 117,000 teachers in the state. After 10/7, we've seen quite a bit of anti-Israel activity across many unions, and especially in teachers' unions. This particular union has had quite a bit of activity, and they passed a resolution that they were going to create a set of curricular resources for their teacher members to use with each other and with their students on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This was very concerning to families because, by all accounts, from some of the other activity in the union, it was felt strongly that such a list that they might create would be extremely anti-Israel. They did, in fact, the Massachusetts Teachers Association did publish this list in December. They published it for their members. And our state of Massachusetts has a special commission that was created this past year to address rising anti-Semitism. At one of the public hearings for the commission, some of the resources on this list were highlighted. And I would say at best, the list is extraordinarily biased in aggregate. And at worst, it promotes materials that are hateful and even overtly anti-Semitic. So for listeners who aren't familiar with this, this story made national news because some of the resources on this list included images such as a Star of David made out of a dollar bill, images calling for violence against Israelis. And there was an image showing Israel and Israelis as a snake, which of course was an image that was used.
Wait, I need to clarify this. You mean these were images included in the curriculum material being given to teachers?
Correct, by the union. Correct.
Okay.
And
just wanted to make sure.
other examples, Sarah?
Sure. There was a lesson plan that appeared to be geared towards kindergarten or first grade, called Handala's Return, and it was about a young Palestinian child. And in the materials, the child says, you know, Zionists are bullies. They're people who steal your home, and this type of thing. So really problematic, hateful material. There was also a book by an activist by the name of Norman Finkelstein, who quite infamously stated after 10/7 that the atrocities committed by Hamas warmed every fiber of his being. So really, really hateful and concerning stuff. After the hearing, there was so much pressure on the union that the union agreed to remove problematic materials from the list. But at this point, they have still only removed some of the materials. And of course, the overwhelming thrust of the list is presenting an extremely pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel narrative. So it continues to be a problem. To your question as to how much the activities of the union has impacted what we're seeing on the ground, very difficult to say. I will tell you, because I want to be clear, we've not yet seen any evidence that these materials have showed up directly in classrooms. And that is a big concern if that does happen. However, I think the slightly more difficult to pinpoint problem is that if there are teachers who are looking to their union on this really complex international conflict, looking to their union for resources to understand it, those teachers are going to get a very particular perspective from these materials that is, you know, pretty harmful and unfair and risks compounding the problem that Jewish and Israeli students are already facing in the
Right,
classroom. So I
right.
sort of liken it to throwing gasoline on a raging fire, potentially.
So we see in the news a lot about the universities, the colleges in the United States that where there is a huge anti-Israel, anti-Zionist sentiment, anti-Semitic sentiment going on. You now tell us about the teachers union in a teachers union in Massachusetts, which is trying to propagate the same. Where does it come from in this Massachusetts Teachers Association? Do you have any information about that?
Well, I think sort of broadly it's complex, but in the case of this union, I would say it's probably the driving force behind it is probably a much smaller group of activist teachers who are trying to promote this particular message. But of course, once you have activist teachers that are in positions of leadership and have some power, there's a great ability to push harmful stuff in the sense that I think what makes this topic so challenging and in some ways so vulnerable to this activity is that it's really complicated. And obviously, the deaths of thousands of Palestinians and including children is horrific to all of us. But if you are presenting that material, and you know, and a very selected group of facts outside of the context of the broader conflict, as well as the the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th, you can really persuade people to a point of view that doesn't really reflect the facts on the ground. And that's the challenge. I think most people do not fall into the category of having a really strong belief on this conflict one way or the other. I think most people are probably in the middle and they're available to some
Vulnerable.
of these arguments. And if they aren't getting complete information, it can be really dangerous. Or if they're getting what looks like, you know, Hamas propaganda, which some of these materials frankly were.
Right.
Have Jewish parents been coming to you for advice about what to do about when they've discovered this going on in their classroom? And for
Absolutely.
example, when schools do not wipe, just leave the bathroom swastikas in the bathroom door and do nothing about it.
Well, I haven't yet seen a case so bad where they've left the swastika in the bathroom, but I will tell you that so much of my work involves talking to parents and families when these things happen, and helping to hopefully at best partner with schools, and at worst, if they're not doing what they're supposed to, really pushing them in the right direction and reminding them of their obligations under the law. So in terms of like what we would want to see and what we tell parents to look for in a school's response, it is a very sad reality right now that I start when I talk to, school administrators or districts by saying, you're not unique in this happening. Unfortunately, this is, that the fact that there was a swastika or anti-Semitic incident is not unique, but how you respond will really define what this looks like. And what we look for in a response is, number one, a clear communication to go out to the school community, naming what happened, naming the community that was harmed, and using it as an opportunity to state very clearly how this violates the ethics and the morals of the school. This is not what we stand for, and this type of thing. Unfortunately, while we see schools get that right with a lot of communities, it is often the case that when it comes to the Jewish community, this gets missed. So that's one thing we want to look for. Another thing we look for is
Wait, clarify. I just
sure.
realized you mean when it comes to um, acts against Jews, that message, as opposed to different ethnic groups, which something would be sent out immediately, that messaging doesn't always get sent out when it's about Jews. Is that what you're saying?
I think sometimes that more frequently you will see condemnations of hate all groups against, Jews, LGBTQ, and a whole list. Whereas when it involves another group, there seems to be no reticence to name that specific group and that group alone, because of course that's the appropriate thing to do. If there was an anti-Muslim incident, the school's response should be directed at that hate and not include anti-Semitism and, anti-LGBTQ plus hate, right? This is the sort of stuff we get into, when it involves the Jewish community.
So
But
you
one,
mean that, Evelyn, just let me clarify. You
sure,
mean this kind of messaging doesn't necessarily mention Jews, even when it's a Jewish incident. It
yes,
goes through the whole litany of blah, 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 blah. Okay.
yes,
Go ahead, Evelyn.
frequent. That is a phenomenon we have frequently noted when there is an incident targeting the Jewish community.
Why is that, you think?
I wish I could answer that question in any meaningful way. I really don't know. I mean, when it comes to issues of Zionism, I think people are squeamish because they know that it's hot and they know that it's controversial, and they don't necessarily, and this is often coming from a totally good place, sort of intent wise. They just don't know. And so they sometimes mess it up because they just don't have the facts and understand how to communicate about it, which is also something that ADL helps to provide. Like, we act as partners, and if you want to send out a message, frequently I will hear from superintendents or school leaders to say, hey, what do you think? This happened, and I'd like to send out this message. Just, do you think that this is appropriate?
Yeah.
But one of the things that I think is so critical for schools to do is that when an incident happens, sure, there's going to be some disciplinary process, for example, if they know who the student responsible was. But more important than that, or in tandem with that, it is critical that that be used as an opportunity to educate. Because of course, when these incidents occur, first of all, they don't just impact the one student who maybe had a comment made to them, right? They impact the whole school community, both would-be victims and would-be perpetrators. All the students are going to end up finding out what happened or some version of what happened, and they are watching the adults to see how is this going to be responded to, and they are taking cues whether we intend to give them or not. So what needs to really happen is there needs to be it needs to be used as a moment to educate. And the third thing I'll mention that we always look for is, does the school have a process in place to respond to hate incidents, not just against the Jewish community, against any of the vulnerable communities? So is there a set of procedures and protocol for what to do? Do kids know where to report these incidents when they happen? That is absolutely critical.
Okay, so there seems to be a confusion around anti-Semitism entangled with anti-Zionism, and it becomes political soon, or easily. So there may be confusion and therefore reluctance to mention Jews as the victims. Um, are there any authorities doing something against the anti-Semitism in these schools and in the teachers' union?
Well, I would say for starters, ADL is of course very involved in attempting to address these issues and guide schools towards the right answer. Um, for the state of Massachusetts, we have the first in the country commission to combat anti-Semitism, and I will tell you they are looking very closely at issues in K through 12. As you pointed out, that we have a raging fire in the college context, but I think we have that only really makes the case that much more strongly that if we do not deal with what we're seeing in K through 12, uh, we have another generation that is going to be very vulnerable to this hate, or to, on the flip side, to being the targets of this hate.
Mhm.
I think, I can't tell you leader for leader who is doing what. There are some voices that are rising above and that we're hearing from. I think more leaders need to be doing more to call out anti-Semitism when it happens in the community and to be speaking about this issue. We need that moral clarity from our leadership about what should be expected and what will not be tolerated. Schools must be an inclusive and safe place for all of our children, including our Jewish and Israeli children.
So, um, I I read when I read a little bit about you that you believe strongly in standing up for other communities as much as for your own. Do you feel others have stood up in this crisis for the Jewish community?
Tough question. I think on an individual level, yes. There are relationships that I have built and folks that I have worked to show up for who have showed up for me broadly for the Jewish community. It would be difficult to argue that we have seen the allyship that I think the community deserves to see. And that has been an extremely painful aspect of what has transpired since 10/7 from my perspective.
And how do you explain it, and what can be done about it?
I don't I don't know that I can explain it except to say that anti-Semitism is incredibly complex. It is incredibly poorly understood. I think that there are certainly bad actors and folks who have intent behind their hate. I think for most people, it isn't that, and it's a matter of ignorance and not understanding. One thing that I think the Jewish community has maybe done a poor job of is communicating Jewish identity. And when I say that, I mean as beyond being a religion. I think, unfortunately, most people have this wrong idea that anti-Semitism is a religious-based hate exclusively. And of course, if you're looking at it in that way, you are probably missing like 95% of the hate that we're seeing play out right now. And that I think is connected to um, the complexities of Jewish identity, and that, it is an ethnicity, it is a shared culture, it is a shared history, all of these sort of positive aspects of Jewish identity. So I don't have a great answer for you except to say that when we look at our history, we see how this virus of anti-Semitism morphs and changes and finds in each sort of historical moment where it shows up, it finds its own nuances to adapt to the moment. And unfortunately, I mean, we're seeing anti-Semitism across the political spectrum right now, but in terms of what we're seeing on the left, it is masquerading as part of the sort of social justice movement. And that is extremely problematic and certainly quite painful for those of us who have, committed our professional lives to fighting for those social justice movements more broadly.
Mhm, mhm. Yes, because so there may be a lack of knowledge about Jewish identity and maybe also the role of Israel um, in that identity. Um, and but maybe in the social justice movement right now, there is an ideology that says, you have queers for Palestine, and that may in the oppressor oppressed lens, that means that the Jews are the oppressors. Could that play a role?
100%. 100%. And I think there's a lot of ignorance involved as well. I mean, for example, um, huge, I suspect a very small percentage of the broader community outside of the Jewish community knows that Jews are a multi-ethnic and multiracial group. They would be very surprised to go to Israel and see what the Jewish community looks like there. And I think this I think there's a lot of people who've been duped, but I think there are more sinister elements that have very intentionally pushed the Palestinian cause to be viewed from the vantage point of race relations in America, which is you couldn't, there is no it's
Correlation.
completely different. Yeah, it's utterly different. And I don't think there's not a more morally clear um scenario or sort of relationship than the experience of, racism towards Black Americans in the history since slavery, right? That is very morally clear cut. There is almost nothing clear cut about the Middle East conflict. So putting that sort of lens over it achieves only really one goal, which is to convince people that it is absolutely morally obvious who's right and who's wrong in the situation. And then, then people are really vulnerable to the propaganda that's used.
I'd like to go back to something because I grew up in Elgin, Illinois, where most of the time I was the only Jewish kid in my classes. I don't think the Jewish community is doing a good job of educating about what Judaism, the religion, the history. So when a high school, no, yeah, a high school sends out a letter and says blah blah blah, and we stand for this morally thing. What's the next step? Does the ADL then go to the school and say, we'd like to add a presentation of this or that in
Mhm.
order to educate your students about what Jews are, because they may not even know that they know a Jew.
That's right. Yeah, so in terms of the education piece, ADL has some really incredible and a broad range of educational programming that we offer to schools. But it also doesn't have to come from us. There are other organizations doing incredible work. I don't know if you've heard of Project Shema, but they've done a really amazing job highlighting the intersectionality within the Jewish community and how to think about Jewish narratives and, make space for that, which is generally a matter that is not understood by the broader community. And frankly, there's a lot of folks within the Jewish community who have a very narrow understanding of who we are as a people that could benefit from some education. So I entirely agree with you.
Evelyn?
Um, Sarah, could you tell us in a nutshell the story of your grandfather during the Holocaust and what we could learn from him in our current fight against anti-Semitism in America and elsewhere in the world?
Thank you so much for that question. Um, so my grandfather was born in Poland, and he had a little bit of course, we know many stories of Jews who didn't believe what was happening around them. I think he had a very strong sense of the danger that was posed by the Nazis. He, at some point, he became engaged to my grandmother. They were separated, and he arranged to have her smuggled from Poland into Slovakia to a place where there were the transports. There was German presence, but it was more limited, and there weren't really any transports at that time.
Wait,
So
wait.
he
At what time? Because we know the Slovakians had transports, then they didn't, and then they did. So
So you know what, I would have to like look back at at the
Okay, just
background to give
curious.
you precise dates. I apologize, but it was during a period of relative quiet, and where things were very bad in Poland. So he paid for false papers and paid smugglers to smuggle her over and across the border. And having done that, he recognized that he could do this for others. So he then set about, I think it was over a period of months, only months, with great urgency, first with his own money and then through money that was raised by what was called the Slovak Working Group, which is various Jews that were engaged in this and connected even uh, pulling from sources out of the country, and paid for the lives of over 1,000 Jews, mostly children. And he took very detailed notes at the time. Only some of them made it over when he came to this country, but he took notes. He had a strong sense of what the Jewish community was facing in terms of our annihilation, and felt it was so important to save children and to document how they had, come to be. And, in most cases, they had been orphaned. So, he ultimately survived the war. He came over to this country, and they were reunited in Prague. And about a year later, my grandmother came. She lost her entire family. He lost everybody but one sister. And in terms of what there is to learn, I mean, I love this question because I've given it a lot of thought recently. I was raised with this incredible legacy and these stories, but I don't think they fully resonated with me in terms of their meaning, or at least a meaning until, what's happened since 10/7. I think that the stories of non-Jews and the righteous among the nations from the Holocaust era are really focused on, and I understand why that is. But I think we've given less attention to the
Absolutely.
stories of Jewish rescuers. And actually, it was in that capacity after my grandmother passed away, my father, sort of somewhat suddenly, in the sense that maybe it hadn't felt as urgent, wanted to have his father's work recognized. And so there is a portion of the permanent exhibit at the Holocaust Museum in DC dedicated to the work of Jewish rescuers. And so there is a small memorial to his work there. But I think it is so important, especially because of the things that we've talked about in terms of the sad lack of allies, right? And a history where we have been targeted and victimized, throughout thousands of years. It's so important for us to know our own strength and our own power. And I spent most of my career focusing on other communities, which is work that I still care very deeply about. But never before 10/7 did it feel so existentially vital that I bring my voice to the cause of our community in fighting back against anti-Semitism. And I think about my grandfather every day, and what he did and what he risked. I mean, at every step of the way, he was risking his own life. As any survivor, he came within an inch of his life on so many occasions. But the sense of our needing to care for each other and look out for each other. I, I have many non-Jewish friends, and I'm a growing number of Jewish friends, but it has been so important to look to other Jews in these moments to gain strength and to remember who we are, and that for whatever we face, our love of life is greater than their hate. And that it is just so important for us to lean on each other and to come together as a community, whatever our differences.
I think those are lovely last words for this podcast. I think it's a really call to action, and I so much appreciate your coming on the show. I appreciate, and Evelyn and I appreciate our listeners very much. If you want to know more about Evelyn and myself, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And please, as Sarah has just said, speak up against anti Semitism and all hate.